Frostbite should have claimed Charlotte the night her pack banished her to the Deadwood. Condemned as a worthless, sickly runt, she was expected to perish quietly among the cursed pines. Instead, she defied their cruel death sentence, returning alongside a terrifying Alpha King to obliterate the monsters who exiled her. Historical texts hidden deep within the private archives of the Highland monasteries, specifically the sealed, blood-stained diaries of Meister Griffith, reveal a terrifying reality about the northern werewolf packs of 1342. In a harsh, unforgiving world where strength dictated your right to breathe, weakness was treated as an infectious disease. Charlotte was born into the Redridge Pack, an isolated and ruthless community nestled in the jagged peaks of the Frostborn Mountains. By the age of 19, Charlotte had not shifted. In lycanthrope society, a wolf who cannot present their beast by their 18th winter is considered cursed, a genetic dead end. She was small, frail, and bore a sickly pallor that made her the target of endless torment. They called her the Runt. They forced her to sleep in the drafty stone cellars, fed her nothing but the rotting scraps of the pack's hunts, and treated her as a slave. But Griffith's diaries reveal a darker, twisted truth that Charlotte herself did not know. She was not inherently weak. Her mother Clara had been an omega of mysterious origins, possessing a rare ancient bloodline that threatened the ruling hierarchy. When Clara died under highly suspicious circumstances, the pack's tyrannical leader Alpha Cedric took Charlotte in. Not out of mercy, but out of paranoia. For over a decade, Cedric had his personal apothecary slip microdoses of silver ash and wolfsbane into Charlotte's meager rations. The poison was meant to suppress her wolf, stunting her growth and keeping her trapped in a state of perpetual agonizing weakness, so she could never challenge his bloodline. Cedric's daughter Vivienne was the golden child of the pack. She was a massive, lethal auburn wolf, vain and cruel, who took immense pleasure in using Charlotte as her personal punching bag. Vivienne's favorite pastime was shredding Charlotte's handmade garments and forcing her to walk barefoot through the freezing mud of the village square. Charlotte endured the beatings, the starvation, and the profound, crushing loneliness, clinging to a desperate hope that one day her wolf would awaken. That hope was violently shattered on the night of the winter solstice. The solstice was a sacred tradition where unmated wolves of age participated in the mating run. Charlotte, shivering in a threadbare tunic, was dragged into the center of the snowy clearing by Beta Garrett. The entire pack surrounded her, their eyes glowing with predatory malice. Alpha Cedric stood atop the clan's ancestral stone, looking down at her with unfiltered disgust. "You have consumed our resources, tainted our air, and brought shame to the Redridge name," Cedric's voice boomed, echoing off the icy cliffs. 19 winters, and you remain a skin sack of human frailty. You are no wolf. You are a parasite. Charlotte fell to her knees, the ice biting into her bare skin. "Please, Alpha," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I work the kitchens. I mend the pelts. I serve the pack. Please do not cast me out." Vivienne stepped forward, a vicious smirk playing on her lips. She grabbed a fistful of Charlotte's dark matted hair and yanked her head back. A pack does not need a servant who smells of sickness and decay. You are an insult to the moon goddess. With a brutal shove, Vivienne cast Charlotte into the snow. Cedric raised his hand, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "By the ancient laws of the Frostborn, I strip you of the Redridge name. I strip you of our protection. You are hereby exiled to the Deadwood. If you are seen within our borders by sunrise, you will be hunted and torn limb from limb. Go." The Deadwood was a sprawling, cursed forest to the north, infested with feral rogues, starving bears, and freezing temperatures that could snap a man's bones. Exile was not merely a dismissal. It was a torturous death sentence. Tears freezing on her cheeks, Charlotte scrambled to her feet. No one stepped forward to defend her. The pack simply parted, creating a narrow path toward the encroaching darkness of the tree line. With nothing but the rags on her back and the fading, suppressed heartbeat of a wolf she had never met, Charlotte walked into the abyss. The haunting howls of the Redridge pack echoed behind her, not in mourning, but in celebration of her demise. The wind in the deadwood was a physical entity, a razor-sharp blade that sliced through Charlotte's thin garments and bit deeply into her flesh. For 3 days she wandered the desolate, snow-choked labyrinth. Her bare feet were blackened by frostbite, her lips cracked and bleeding. She survived by eating bitter pine needles and drinking from half-frozen puddles, but her body was rapidly shutting down. The wolfsbane that had been in her system for years was finally flushing out, leaving her in a state of feverish, agonizing withdrawal. Her bones ached as if they were splintering from the inside. On the twilight of the 3rd day, the scent of rotting meat and wet fur reached her nose. Charlotte collapsed against the trunk of a massive dead oak, her breathing shallow. From the shadows of the tree line, 3 massive mangy wolves emerged. They were rogues, feral outcasted males driven mad by isolation and hunger. Their yellow eyes locked onto her trembling form. They snapped their jaws saliva, dripping onto the snow circling her with agonizing slowness. Charlotte closed her eyes. She was too exhausted to cry, too broken to fight. Let it be quick, she prayed to a goddess she wasn't sure was listening. Please just let it be quick. The lead rogue lunged, but the fatal bite never came. A sound erupted through the forest, a roar so deafening, so deeply steeped in ancient primal power, that the ground itself seemed to fracture. A massive shadow plummeted from the ridge above, landing squarely on the lead rogue. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a high-pitched yelp, and then absolute silence. Charlotte forced her eyes open. Standing over the mangled corpse of the rogue was a wolf unlike anything she had ever seen. He was a titan easily twice the size of Alpha Cedric, with fur as black as the midnight sky and eyes that burned like molten gold. Scars crisscrossed his massive muzzle and shoulders, a roadmap of 100 victorious wars. The remaining 2 rogues whimpered, dropping to their bellies in immediate, terrifying submission. They recognized what stood before them. This was no ordinary Alpha. This was Eric the Alpha King of the Ironclaw Empire, known across the continent as the Scourge of the Highlands. Eric had conquered 6 territories before his 30th winter. He was a warlord of unmatched brutality, a king who ruled an army of 10,000 wolves. Rumors said his heart was made of ice, and that he had slaughtered entire covens without blinking. With a terrifying swiftness, the giant black wolf dispatched the remaining rogues, tearing out their throats with clinical precision. Once the threats were neutralized, the massive beast turned slowly, those molten gold eyes fixing entirely on Charlotte. She pressed herself against the tree, terror seizing her lungs. She was about to be devoured by a monster. Instead, the giant wolf lowered his massive head and took a deep, resonant breath. The moment his nose caught her scent, a violent shudder rippled through his colossal frame. A low, vibrating whine escaped his chest. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was a sound of profound, world-shattering reverence. Before her eyes, the wolf's bones cracked and shifted, morphing into a man of staggering, intimidating stature. Eric stood tall, oblivious to the freezing cold, his muscular physique marred by pale scars. He had dark, sweeping hair and a chiseled aristocratic jawline. But it was his eyes that captivated her. They were no longer the eyes of a killer. They were wide, desperate, and filled with an awe that bordered on worship. He dropped to his knees in the snow before her, ignoring the blood soaking into his dark trousers. He reached out with large, calloused hands, stopping just inches from her face, as if terrified that touching her might break her. "Mate." His voice was a deep, gravelly rasp, trembling with an emotion that the warlord had never known. "My mate." Charlotte stared at him, her fever-addled brain struggling to comprehend. "Mate. How could the most feared king in the Lycan world be mated to a runt? I am nothing." She managed to croak her voice, barely a whisper. "I have no wolf. I'm broken." Eric's jaw clenched a muscle, feathering violently in his cheek as his eyes swept over her emaciated frame, her bruised face, and her frost-bitten feet. A dangerous, lethal darkness passed behind his golden eyes. He could smell the sickness, the malnutrition, and the faint, lingering scent of wolfsbane that coated her pores. He realized instantly that his fated mate hadn't merely been lost. She had been tortured. Gently, with a tenderness that defied his terrifying reputation, Eric removed his heavy, fur-lined cloak and wrapped it tightly around her shivering body. He scooped her into his massive arms as effortlessly as if she were a feather. She buried her face into his chest, overwhelmed by the intoxicating scent of cedar snow and overwhelming safety. "You are not broken, little one," Eric whispered against her hair, his arms locking around her like an impenetrable fortress. "You have been poisoned, and the ones who did this to you—" He looked toward the southern horizon, in the direction of the Redridge territory. The sheer murderous intent in his voice caused the surrounding trees to seem to shrink back. "Will drown in rivers of their own blood." Eric carried her away from the deadwood, embarking on a relentless march toward his impenetrable mountain fortress, the obsidian citadel of Calenhold. For a week, Charlotte drifted in and out of consciousness. She vaguely remembered the opulent chambers, the roaring fireplaces, and the gentle hands of Beatrice, the king's most trusted healer. She remembered the taste of warm broth and the constant reassuring rumble of Eric's chest as he refused to leave her bedside, sleeping in a chair beside her, and growling at anyone who dared enter too loudly. Under Beatrice's care, the residual wolfsbane was purged from Charlotte's bloodstream. Ancient elixirs and a diet of rich enchanted meats began to repair the damage of 19 years of starvation. As the poison left her system, something miraculous began to happen. The fever broke, her skin took on a healthy, radiant glow, and deep within her soul, a dormant, colossal presence began to stir. On the 8th night, Charlotte awoke abruptly. The pain was gone. In its place was a surging electric power that hummed through her veins. She sat up, tossing the heavy silk sheets aside. Eric was instantly awake, moving to her side with a look of frantic concern. "Charlotte?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel fear. She felt strong. She felt lethal. She blinked, and the reflection in the polished silver mirror across the room caught her eye. Her irises had shifted from their normal hazel to a brilliant, glowing amethyst, the legendary eye color of the first Omegas, a royal bloodline thought to have been extinct for centuries. Eric stared at her eyes, dropping to one knee beside the bed, bowing his head in absolute devotion. Not only had he found his fated mate, but she was Lycan royalty. Charlotte touched her own face, feeling the hum of her awakened beast. The wolf inside her was angry. It remembered the cellar. It remembered Vivian's laughter. It remembered Cedric's betrayal. "Eric," Charlotte said, her voice clear, commanding, and ringing with a newfound authority that made the Alpha King's pulse race. He looked up, his golden eyes burning with loyalty. "Command me, my queen." "I want my home back," she said quietly. and I want them to pay." A terrifying, beautiful smile spread across Eric's scarred face. He stood up, turning toward the heavy oak doors of the bedchamber. "Garrick," he roared. Within seconds, his beta, a heavily armored warrior, threw the doors open, bowing low. "My king, rouse the vanguard!" Eric ordered, his voice echoing with the promise of absolute destruction. "Summon the Ironclaw legions. We march on Redridge at dawn. Tell the men to sharpen their blades. We are leaving no survivors." Archival letters from Lord Commander Harrison, currently preserved under climate-controlled glass at the Lycan Antiquities Wing of the National Museum, provide a chilling first-hand account of what happened next. The Ironclaw vanguard did not merely march. They descended upon the southern valleys like an apocalyptic storm. 10,000 elite Lycan warriors clad in blackened steel and furs moved with a synchronized predatory silence that terrified the neighboring territories. Villages locked their doors and rival alphas sent frantic emissaries of peace, terrified that Eric's wrath was aimed at them. But the Alpha King had only one destination: Redridge. Panic infected the Redridge pack long before the first Ironclaw banner breached the horizon. For days, the scouts had reported a massive disturbance in the north. The wildlife was fleeing southward in massive stampedes, and a deep, unnatural vibration rattled the stone foundations of the packhouse. Alpha Cedric paced the length of his grand hall, his usual arrogance replaced by a gnawing, cold dread. He had received no formal declaration of war, no demands for tribute. On the dawn of the 5th day, since Charlotte's exile, the warning horns of Redridge blared. It was not a rhythmic call to arms, but a frantic, breathless shriek that ended abruptly silenced by an Ironclaw archer. Cedric followed closely by a trembling Vivian, and his beta Garrett rushed to the battlements of their wooden palisade. What they saw stole the very breath from their lungs. The valley below, usually pristine and blanketed in white snow, was swallowed by a sea of black armor and massive snarling direwolves. The Ironclaw Legion had surrounded the settlement completely. There were no siege engines, no battering rams. They didn't need them. The sheer volume of dominant, bloodthirsty beasts was enough to tear the palisade down with their bare claws. At the head of the army stood Eric. He did not wear a helm, allowing the freezing wind to whip his dark hair around his scarred face. His molten gold eyes locked onto Cedric, standing on the wall, and the sheer force of the king's killing intent brought several Redridge guards to their knees, clutching their throats as their wolves submitted to the overwhelming aura. Cedric, desperate to save his own skin, commanded the heavy oak gates to be opened. He walked out into the snow, forcing a diplomatic, obsequious smile onto his face, though his knees knocked together. Vivian trailed behind him, her eyes wide, as she took in the majestic, terrifying form of the Alpha King. She immediately straightened her posture, fluffing her luxurious fur coat, vainly hoping the king had come seeking a formidable mate. "King Eric." Cedric called out, his voice cracking slightly as he bowed low. "Redridge is profoundly honored by your sudden arrival. Had we known you were coming, we would have prepared a feast. Please tell me, what do we owe the glory of the Ironclaw Empire at our humble borders? Do you require tribute supplies?" Eric sat atop a massive armored warhorse, his expression carved from granite. He did not say a word. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the low rumbling growls of 10,000 Ironclaw wolves waiting for the command to slaughter. Cedric swallowed hard, misinterpreting the silence. He grabbed Vivian by the arm and pulled her forward. "If it is a political alliance, you seek my lord, I offer you my daughter Vivian. She is the strongest female in the Frostborn Mountains, a pure-blooded fighter who would give you mighty heirs." A dark, cruel chuckle rumbled from Eric's chest, cutting Cedric off. The sound was so filled with malice that Vivian actually recoiled, her haughty facade crumbling. "I have not come for your grain. Cedric!" Eric's voice boomed across the valley, vibrating with a deadly frequency, and I would sooner mate with a rotting corpse than touch the pathetic offspring of a traitorous coward. Cedric paled, taking a step back. My king? I do not understand. You cast out a member of your pack into the deadwood." Eric stated, his eyes narrowing into predatory slits. A girl, 19 winters, left to starve and freeze. Relief, bizarre and misplaced, washed over Cedric's face. He let out a nervous laugh. "Charlotte, my king, you march an army of 10,000 for a runt. She was a blight on our bloodline, a skin sack of sickness who could not even shift. I was merely pruning the weak from the strong, as is the ancient way. If she offended you in her feral wandering, I apologize, but she is no longer of Redridge." Eric dismounted his horse with a fluid, lethal grace. The snow crunched beneath his heavy boots as he stepped forward. "She did not offend me, Cedric. She completed me. From the parted ranks of the king's personal guard, a massive enclosed carriage, constructed of dark iron and velvet, rolled forward. The heavy doors swung open. The breath collectively hitched in the throats of the Redridge pack members who had gathered at the gates. Stepping out of the carriage, wrapped in the royal fur-lined cloak of the Iron Claw Queen, was Charlotte. But she was no longer the frail, bruised and shivering runt they had tormented for years. The sickly pallor was gone, replaced by a radiant, flushed complexion. She stood tall, her posture screaming of absolute royalty, and a terrifying humming power radiated from her skin. But it was her eyes that made Cedric gasp in sheer, unadulterated terror. They were no longer hazel. They burned with a brilliant, glowing amethyst light. Professor Arthur Pendleton's archived transcripts at Oxford's Lycanthropic Law Department emphasize the rarity of this moment. Notes a modern historian. The amethyst eyes of the first Omegas had not been seen in 400 years. To the lycanthropes of the 14th century, it was the equivalent of witnessing a living deity step onto the battlefield. "Charlotte," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and sudden venomous jealousy. How are you alive?" Charlotte walked forward, standing directly beside the Alpha King. Eric reached out his massive, scarred hand, gently wrapping around her waist in a public, undeniable display of absolute possession and devotion. "You poisoned me, Cedric," Charlotte said. Her voice, once soft and pleading, now carried the resonant, commanding echo of her awakened beast. It swept through the valley, causing the Redridge wolves to whimper in shame. "For a decade you fed me wolfsbane. You kept my beast locked away because you knew what I was, because you knew who my mother truly was." Cedric's face drained of all color. He backed away, shaking his head. "Lies slander you are a runt." "Am I?" Charlotte asked softly. Charlotte closed her eyes, and the air around her began to crackle with an intense, palpable static. The scent of ozone, blooming nightshade, and pure, concentrated power flooded the battlefield. She did not need to strip her clothes. The shift was instantaneous, a flash of blinding ethereal light that forced the onlookers to shield their eyes. When the light faded, Charlotte was gone. In her place stood a wolf of mythical proportions. She was nearly as massive as Eric, but where he was built of dark, scarred muscle and brute force, she was a vision of lethal, streamlined elegance. Her fur was a flawless, luminescent white that seemed to glow against the dreary grey sky. Her amethyst eyes blazed with the fury of centuries of silenced Omegas. She let out a howl. It was not a call for blood. It was a frequency that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the soul of every lycanthrope present. It was the command of the first Omega, the mother blood of all wolves. Instantly, the entire Redridge pack collapsed. They did not bow out of fear. They were physically forced to the earth by their own beasts. The instinct to submit to the Royal Omega was encoded into their very DNA. Even Vivian, fighting with all her might, was slammed to her knees, her face pressed into the freezing mud as she sobbed in humiliation and terror. Only Cedric remained standing, though his body shook violently. As he fought the compulsion, his corrupted alpha spark burning itself out in a vain attempt to resist her power. Charlotte shifted back to her human form with the same breathtaking speed. Eric immediately draped his heavy cloak back over her shoulders, his eyes fixed on her with absolute reverence. "Your father did not build this pack," Charlotte said, walking slowly toward the struggling Cedric. "My mother Clara was the last descendant of the Silver Moon Royals. She sought refuge here. You mated her, and when you realized her bloodline would eventually overshadow yours, you murdered her, and you imprisoned me in my own body. I am the Alpha." Cedric roared, a desperate, pathetic sound. He lunged at Charlotte, his claws extending a last-ditch effort to kill the threat to his stolen throne. He never made it within 5 feet of her. Eric moved faster than the human eye could track. His hand shot out, clamping around Cedric's throat like a steel vice. He lifted the false alpha entirely off the ground, cutting off his air supply. Cedric kicked and thrashed his claws, scraping uselessly against Eric's blackened armor. "You are nothing," Eric snarled, his golden eyes burning with lethal promise. "You are a thief who tortured my queen, and for that there is only one punishment." "Wait," Charlotte commanded. Eric paused, his grip tightening just enough to keep Cedric on the absolute brink of unconsciousness. He looked at his mate, ready to drop the man if she wished to deliver the final blow herself. Charlotte looked down at Vivian, who was still paralyzed in the mud, weeping hysterically. "Vivian." Charlotte said, her voice cold and completely devoid of pity. "You stripped me of my clothes. You forced me to walk barefoot in the snow. You cheered as I was cast into the deadwood." "Please," Vivian shrieked, tears and snot mixing on her beautiful face. "I am sorry I was blind. Have mercy. Charlotte, please." "I am showing you exactly the mercy you showed me," Charlotte replied. She turned her amethyst gaze back to the ruined pack. "By the ancient laws of the Frostborn, I, Charlotte, rightful heir of Redridge and queen of the Ironclaw Empire, strip Vivian of her name. I strip her of our protection. She is exiled to the Deadwood." Vivian screamed, a sound of absolute soul-shattering despair. 2 massive Ironclaw guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing the struggling woman by her arms and dragging her relentlessly toward the dark, forbidding tree line of the cursed forest. Her screams echoed off the mountains until she vanished into the shadows. Charlotte then turned to Cedric, who was turning purple in Eric's grasp. "As for you," Charlotte whispered, her eyes devoid of emotion, "you do not deserve the honor of a wolf's death. You will die as the coward you are." She nodded once to Eric. The Alpha King did not hesitate. With a violent, effortless twist of his wrist, a sickening crack echoed through the silent valley. Cedric's struggling stopped instantly. Eric tossed the lifeless body of the false Alpha into the snow, wiping his armored gauntlet with a look of profound disgust. The Redridge pack remained on their knees, trembling, waiting for the Ironclaw army to descend and slaughter them all. Instead, Charlotte stepped up onto the very ancestral stone where she had been condemned just 5 days prior. Eric stood at the base of the rock, the ultimate lethal guardian of his newfound queen. "Redridge is no longer an independent territory," Charlotte announced to the terrified masses. "It is now a province of the Ironclaw Empire. You will no longer measure your worth by cruelty. You will no longer cast out the weak. You will protect them. You will feed them. Because if I hear of a single wolf being treated as a runt in my kingdom, my king will not be the one who comes for you. I will." The pack bowed lower, pressing their foreheads to the snow, howling their absolute submission and loyalty to their new queen. Charlotte looked down at Eric, the warlord who had conquered 6 territories, the beast whose name was whispered in terror across the continent, was looking up at her with a gentle, adoring smile. He reached up, taking her hand in his, and kissed her knuckles. She had been cast out to die as a forgotten runt. She returned as a god with a king willing to burn the world to the ground just to keep her warm. Did Charlotte's brutal but absolutely justified revenge satisfy your craving for karma? Drop a massive, like if you believe true power always rises from the ashes. Share this epic werewolf drama with your friends who love a fierce underdog story, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heart-pounding tales of betrayal-fated mates and ultimate alpha justice. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a wild upload.